Islam presents Jesus as Messiah, born of a virgin and a performer of miracles. Christianity says his death and resurrection are the center of his mission. Isaac, let's begin with foundation. What exactly is the Islamic dilemma and why does it matter?
The dilemma is stated like this. If the Quran is true and accurate, then Islam is false. And if the Quran, is not true and it's not been altered in any way, then Islam is false as well. That no matter which option is true, that Islam is false. Why is this? Well, obviously, if the Quran is false, if there are errors in it, if there are mistakes, if there are textual issues, historical errors, then Islam is false because Islam claims that the Quran is the literal words of Allah written before time began and given to Muhammad word for word. And so if there's any error, of course, that invalidates the entire premise of Islam in terms of its theology of the Quran. The other side of the dilemma, though, is what's really interesting, is even if the Quran is true, the Islamic dilemma argues that Islam is still false because the Quran in various different places, for example, Surah 5:48, tells Muslims to tells Muslims to interpret the Quran through the lens of the Bible and the scriptures given to the Christians and the Jews.
Yes.
And it affirms the inspiration and it affirms the preservation of the Christian and Jewish scriptures. And so various times, for example, the Quran calls it a light and a guidance. And it even tells Muslims, if they are in doubt about the words of Muhammad, to go talk to the people of the book.
Right.
And they will help the Muslims understand the Quran. And it even tells Christians that they are to judge by what is in their own book. So what this means is that the core claim of the Islamic dilemma and where the argument comes in, where Muslim apologists will push back and where Christian apologists are trying to make their case, is this claim that the Quran is affirming the inspiration and the preservation of the Christian scriptures. And of course, if the Bible is preserved and is accurate and we can rely on it, then Islam is still false because there are numerous core elements of the Bible that disagree with Islamic doctrine today. And so the heart of the Islamic dilemma is to say, either way, whether the Quran is accurate and true or whether it's not accurate and true, it creates a big problem for the Islamic side. And the way that a Muslim has to argue is for him to argue that actually the Quran does not affirm the totality of the preservation or the totality of the inspiration of the New Testament and of the Old Testament. Instead, the argument is going to hinge around some questions about, is it the whole thing or is it parts of it? How has that was it maybe originally inspired but then later corrupted?
Right.
And so
How
that's
do you
really
how would you determine what's inspired and what's not?
Again, I would say, if I'm being as fair-minded as I can, I have not yet heard a convincing Islamic counterpoint to the exegetical method that you could use when reading the Bible to determine what is accurate and what is not. Typically, Islamic scholars have said that the Bible can be said to be accurate by insofar as it agrees with the Quran. And so that will be the exegetical method they use. But of course, as trying to be, somewhat neutral, somewhat fair-minded, somewhat scholarly researchers on this issue,
right,
we can't use that exegetical method. That's circular reasoning. So I can't, as a neutral party, I can't say, well, the Bible is corrupted only, but the parts that agree with the Quran aren't.
Yeah.
The question then is why though? Why? And if you can't give a good reason why, and I don't think most Muslim apologists particularly try to give reasons why in this type of argument, they will say that this is an axiom of some sort, or they will shift the debate to reasons to trust the Quran, which is a fair thing to talk about, but it is a different topic. This is really where the debate comes around, is exactly what happened and what do we mean by preservation.
Okay, so there are things in the Bible and the Quran that we agree on.
Yeah.
Is there a common ground that some things that we would definitively say about the two books?
Yeah, this is a really fascinating area of study. And I think actually there is some really good cutting edge research being done by some Islamic scholars, Quranic scholars. I would say the forefront of this is a scholar named Gabriel Said Reynolds. He's an excellent scholar from Notre Dame who is really pushing the limits on the intertextuality between the Bible and the Quran. Because up till now, sorry, just to give a bit of background, for those who might not be familiar, what's odd and interesting about Quranic studies as opposed to biblical studies is the way that the Western world and academia treats the two books historically. The Bible from the late 1800s has been under an immense amount of scrutiny from secular and skeptical scholars. And so, as we know from the search for the true Jesus and then the new search for Jesus, there's been a lot of ink spilled on to what extent has the biblical text been corrupted? What was the process of transmission? What can we trust? What can we not trust? Anyone who's even taken a preliminary course in seminary knows that the scholarly standpoint toward the Bible is very skeptical, extremely skeptical. And so if you go from that world into the Quranic studies world, it can be a bit of whiplash, because actually, even to this day, the majority of non-Muslim Quranic scholars accept the Muslim story at face value as a starting point, that they will kind of assume that the Muslim story about the founding of Islam, that the life of Muhammad, the founding of the Quran, the writing of the Quran, the transmission of the Quran, that all of that is to be kind of trusted, generally speaking, until proven otherwise. That's starting to change now, but historically, that was the majority kind of secular position. So you'd have scholars on the one hand who are secular, who talk about the Bible in this extremely skeptical way, but then they would take on face value the early Islamic community stories about Muhammad, but they wouldn't do that about, say, Jesus.
The Bible,
So that is the background for this intertextuality debate, because I think what has happened is that scholars have gotten caught up into two people who examine this have gotten caught up into two camps, which actually end up being the same camp. On the one side, you have these Islamic and these secular scholars who are kind of starting from a position of, this is something to be trusted. And then you have the backlash, which is the Christian apologetic side, which is like, no, it's completely different. The Quran is, it's getting all these things wrong in the Bible, because if you read the Quran, you notice there are many stories that are not found in the Bible or that are changed from the Bible. So, for example, there's a story about when the children of Israel are on Mount Sinai. God picks up Mount Sinai physically and holds it over top of them, and then he relents and then puts it back. And so a Christian reads that and goes, oh, this is clearly a corruption. And so the Christian apologetic side has started tried to deny this connection and say, really, there might be some connection here, but it can't be that much, because they're getting these stories wrong. Or, for example, the Quran does not understand that Mary, Jesus' mother, is a different person than Mary or Miriam, Moses' sister. So in the Quran, it talks about Jesus' mother being the sister of Moses.
Oh, really?
So again, that's another example where clearly, if you're looking at it from a kind of a purely apologetic lens, it sounds like, the Quranic author heard stories about Mary, Miriam, and then of course in Arabic and Hebrew, these are the same name. Miriam and Mary are the same name. And so he got them mixed up. And so there are various parts of the Quran that are like this, where, it adds stories, for example, about Jesus as a child, where he creates some birds out of clay and then breathes on them and they turn into real life birds. And so this is the if I want to say, the shallow back and forth. But what scholars now are starting to do is dig a little bit deeper and realizing that actually the source for the Quran, or the connection between the Quran and the Bible, is not a direct connection. The connection between the Quran and the Bible is the connection between the Quran and Syriac Christians in late antiquity. And that is the community that we need to be looking at. And when we look at the Syriac Christian community, for example, the writings of people like Jacob of Sarug, a couple hundred years before Muhammad, we see a lot of connections. In fact, all of these issues that we see today as errors or fabrications of the Quran, we find these exact stories in the Syriac Christian literature that predates Islam. And so what we find is that, for example, the story about the God holding at Mount Sinai over the children of Israel, that is a story from the Talmud. That is a story from the Rabbinic Judaism that was taken into Syriac Christianity
Wow.
and was incorporated into their stories about how they interpreted certain parts of the Old Testament. These stories about the infancy of Jesus, where he speaks from the cradle, or where he creates the birds out of clay. Those are stories from the Syriac Christian community. They were telling these stories about Jesus in their communities. They weren't, writing them down as scripture, but they were
Right.
orally communicating these stories.
Sure.
And so, as we go through the Quran, what we see is actually not only a high level of connection between the Bible and the Quran, but particularly a high level of connection between the Syriac Christian interpretation or exegetical interpretation of the Bible and how that plays into the Quran. That is very, very close.
Now, I noticed in when I looked at the Quran that Mary or Miriam is referred to as someone who has never been touched by man,
Mhm,
and the child born to her is a pure boy. But they
mhm.
say that's Moses' sister as opposed to Mary, the mother of Jesus. Correct? Is that right?
It associates Mary with the it just says that she is the mother of Jesus and she's also the sister of Moses.
Oh, okay. Interesting. Interesting. So, what is the understanding regarding the crucifixion then?
Well, this is a really controversial issue. Again, a bit of backstory here. When early Christians like John of Damascus, who was one of the earliest Christians that we have a record of interacting with Islam as it was being formed,
Right.
we're talking 8th century here. When they were talking about Islam, they actually were very accepting of it in a lot of ways. They
Really?
say, you know what, this isn't bad. You guys have a couple things wrong, but you know what, we can get on board with this. Which also partially explains
Hmm.
how Islam spread so fast.
Right.
Is because early Islam was not identifying itself as a reified religion separate from Christianity. So scholars like Stephen Shoemaker, for example, have made this argument that early Islam, we're talking prior to, at least, definitely prior to the 8th century, but definitely prior to the 9th century, we're talking about Muhammad's generation, then the few generations after him, 50, 60 years after him, Islam was not viewed by its own people or by others as a separate religion. It was just a movement, a monotheistic movement, an Abrahamic
Hmm.
monotheistic movement that had apocalyptic overtones and was coming out of the desert as the Christians expected the apocalypse would come. And so when the guys showed up, they were not saying, oh, we are Muslims and you are Christians and we are
Right.
different from you. It was more like, we are all believers. We have differences amongst ourselves. It was more like an in-house debate type
Yeah.
thing. And so when John of Damascus has a debate with the caliph in Baghdad, he actually says a lot of very complimentary things about the Quran. He's like, you know what, I see a lot of truth in it. And again, if we go back to the previous point about how it's similar in the Syriac Christian traditions, a Syriac
Right.
Christian like John of Damascus recognized all these stories for what they were, which is from his own tradition. And even what's interesting is a lot of the early Christian debaters looked at the issue of the resurrection and the death and resurrection of Jesus and did not see an inherent problem here. Because the only verse in the Quran which talks about the death of Jesus is Surah 5, verse 142. And it's unfortunate in terms of a textual criticism lens of that there's only one verse, there's only one line, one verse that talks about it. And it says, they did not kill him, they did not crucify him, it only appeared to them as such.
Right.
This Arabic verb shubbiha, that appeared to them, comes under extreme scrutiny from the very earliest times until now. What does it mean? It appeared to them as such. Now, the they in this verse, they did not crucify him. This is referring to the Jews. That is the previous antecedent. And so there are multiple different interpretations that are valid, in my opinion, valid textual interpretations. But what happened, so I'll give you the three. The one is that that a lot of Christians took was that this was affirming Jesus' death and resurrection, or at least his death in this case. Well, no, actually death and resurrection in this case, because they did not kill him. Yes, they killed his body, but like he rose again. So then they did not really kill him. It appeared to them like they killed him because they put his body in the tomb, but really he's alive. And in fact, there are other verses in the Quran which say, do not weep for those who are departed. They are with your Lord. And so there are other verses in the Quran which seem to indicate that, death is not this final thing, that you shouldn't necessarily treat the dead as if they're always dead, that they are in some sense not dead. So that is one interpretation. The second is that this is just focusing on the Jews, that the they is doing a lot of work here, that if they did not kill him, they did not crucify him. Why? Because it was the Romans who killed him and crucified him. And it appeared to the Jews that they crucified him because they were taking credit for it. And a lot of the Quran is an anti-Jewish polemic. The Jews really take a lot of hits in the Quran, much more so than Christians. And so that would be the second interpretation, that this is just clarifying the story. Like, no, Jews, you didn't do this. The Romans did it. And then the third interpretation is what became fossilized because of the monopoly that the powerful Islamic exegetical forces, some of the early interpreters, what are known as mufassirin, the early interpreters of Islam, people, for example, like Ibn Kathir, who compiled these commentaries about the Quran, that they all gave this interpretation, or they all favored this interpretation of saying, actually, he was not killed at all, he was not crucified at all. And then there are multiple different theories that are brought in terms of what could this mean. And so the most popular one is known as the substitution theory, which is that at some point the day before, probably during Passover, Jesus and his disciples are sitting around, and then Jesus says, hey guys, they're going to come for me. Will someone take my place? And then there are two main versions of the story. One version is that Judas, who Jesus knows has betrayed him, gets turned into the likeness of Jesus, and magical. He becomes like Jesus, and then Jesus ascends into heaven immediately right then and there. The Jews come in, they see Jesus, and then they crucify him, but actually it was Judas. Another version basically is the same thing, but it's not just Judas, it's all of the disciples get turned into Jesus, and then he gets taken up to heaven, and then they just pick one and then crucify him. But what's fascinating is the reversal, right? The reversal. Instead, in Christianity, you have Jesus dying in our place, and in these Islamic interpretations, you have others dying in his place. But you see, the thing is that these interpretations struggle with is there's nothing in the Quran to give any hint toward this interpretation. There's no, like I said, the only verse is this one verse that's very vague. So they're relying on all the speculation. And so this is for this very long answer, but this really comes down to it is
thorough. I love it.
It is one of the most kind of difficult, thorny problems that we deal with, because again, it's weird. You have this weird unholy alliance between a lot of Christian apologists and a lot of Islamic scholars, where both the Christian apologists and Islamic scholars are both arguing, no, this verse does not affirm the death and resurrection of Jesus, because the Christians want the Quran to deny that, because it gives them leverage because of all the historical evidence we have for that. And the Muslims want to deny it because that's what their interpreters say. My personal opinion is, if I had to, gun to my head, if I had to make a guess, I would actually lean toward the side of, I don't think the Quran is denying this, because just quickly, recent scholarship by scholars like Ahmed al-Jalad have shown that pre-Islamic Arabia was not pagan, like the Islamic stories tell us. It was not a pagan place. It was a heavily Christianized place with some Jewish communities as well, which of course makes sense, because the Mediterranean world was Christian. The late antique world was a Christian world. And so we see from rock inscriptions, that's what his area of expertise is. From rock inscriptions, he can see that there are all these Christian names, Christian prayers, Christian invocations to Christian God. We don't see pagan names, we don't see pagan gods, etc. So he's established, it seems to be, that pre-Islamic Arabia was heavily Christianized. So if it was Christianized, would it make sense for a prophet in that context to go and deny the most fundamental belief in Christianity? That seems highly implausible. It seems like few people would accept that as a valid interpretation. So my personal opinion, again, this is not the majority opinion of scholars, but based on the newer scholarship, I would say it seems more likely to me that the Quran is not necessarily pushing back on the fact that he was, killed and rose again, but more on the Christian interpretation of what that means and how we should apply that.
So is that their strongest point? The Muslims' strongest counterpoint?
In terms of a generalized, like, what would be the Muslim steel man argument against the Christian worldview? No, I would say not. I would say their strongest counterpoint is going to be the Trinity,
Right.
probably because it's a very philosophical issue, and I think most Christians have a hard time addressing that or giving a good response to arguments against the Trinity.
Well, I think even Christians that have been Christians for a long time have trouble explaining the Trinity.
Yeah, exactly.
I mean, it's pretty. I mean, you have these H2O metaphors, the egg metaphor, the tree
Mhm.
metaphor, and
Mhm.
these things are. It's really a difficult thing to understand. So, how do we as Christians
Mhm.
come at this when speaking to Muslims and still be respectful to their beliefs?
Yeah, that's a great question. I think a lot of times, the first thing in terms of respect, um, respect is extremely important, but I also think that being strong is equally important. And actually,
Okay.
I dialogue with Muslims both here in Canada as well as in the Middle East and in Asia. And one feedback I get a lot is Muslims will often say it's refreshing to talk to a Christian who cares about his faith. What they mean by that is a lot of times Muslims interpret Christians trying to be kind as them being weak or uncertain, though sometimes they are both of those things. But
Right.
it's important to understand how we're coming across. And so I would say sometimes, again, this takes discernment. It's not easy, but sometimes the way we can show respect to a Muslim is actually being very direct and strong.
And
Obviously,
firm.
you
Yeah.
know, not yelling, not insulting, but just being, for example, I had a Muslim fellow in North Africa. I was talking with me, and he said, "Wait. So you think I'm going to hell?" And so, how do you respond? Do we like soft pedal it? Do we go like, yeah, I mean, I don't know, I'm not the judge, God is the judge, yada yada,
Right.
or do we say, yes, you're definitely going to hell,
Wow.
unless you repent? And that's what I said, and he actually appreciated that. He said, "Oh, thank you. I've been trying to get Christians to tell me, and no one is giving me a
Yeah.
straight answer." So I would just start off by saying we need to make sure that we don't go too far, especially in Canada. I think we go way too far on the side of being afraid of coming across as rude, and in
Right.
the process, we come across as weak. And so we just need to look at Jesus. How did he do it? I think he's a good model for us. He was kind. He was respectful. He didn't mindlessly throw out you know insults, but he did tell the truth when the
Right.
Pharisees were being broods of vipers, he called them broods of vipers. When they were being whitewashed tombs, he called them whitewashed tombs. Right?
Yeah.
He was very direct with people, and so I think just something to bear in mind. We just need to balance those two things. Now, when it comes to the Trinity, I think the first issue we have, to be honest, the Trinity issue is a powerful rhetorical argument for Muslims, but it is not a powerful logical argument. It just takes a lot of Christians fall into the trap of the rhetorical side and don't ever get to the logical side. So if a Muslim, or not even a Muslim, and a Mormon, others, people who deny the Trinity, if they say, what's the deal with the Trinity? It makes no sense. How can God be three in one? The first thing we have to say is there is no strict logical contradiction in the Trinity. That a strict logical contradiction would be to say, for example, that A equals B and B does not equal A, right? That we could say that God, if we were to say God is three persons and also one person, that would be a strict logical contradiction. That cannot be. If that was our claim, then the Trinity is false. That's impossible. Instead, our argument is that God is three persons and one being. Now, someone may say, what does that mean? How can be what's the difference between person and being? Well, a person is the essence or quality of who something is, and a being is the essence or quality of what something is. And we actually see this in our daily life. For example, personhood and beinghood are not identical. They're not interchangeable. I'm a person. I'm a one person. I'm also one being. I'm one human being. A rock is also one being, but it's zero persons. There's no personhood that belongs to a rock. So already, just in that example, we see that personhood and beinghood are not tied together. They are separate ideas that can be applied in different ways. And so we are saying as Christians that God is one being, one what, three whos. Okay, so once we've established this, now this point is not controversial in the sense of like the question of, is there a strict logical contradiction here? That's not controversial. You're not going to find any mathematician logician who argues that this is a logical contradiction. If someone says that it is, they're just wrong. It's just incorrect. Typically, when someone who's arguing or talking with us in good faith, once we explain that, typically they will see that and say, okay, fair enough. This still makes no sense. I don't understand. I can't wrap my head around this. And to that, I think this is where the Christian really needs to understand. We need to put the challenge back on the Muslim and say, fair enough, I agree with you. Now you give me one attribute of God that you believe in, that you are able to fully wrap your head around and understand. Because what we see is as soon as we start listing attributes of God, name any attribute of God, we say, God is infinite. Can you wrap, we understand that in a theoretical sense, in a logical sense, there's no logical issue there. But don't tell me that you can wrap your head around what it means to be infinite or timeless. Oh, what does it mean that God is outside of time? How does that, what? I can't possibly come close to imagining that, right? To picturing that. How does that work? Any attribute of God that we want to give, how is God all loving? How is God all powerful? Any attribute is going to be something that we acknowledge kind of rationally. We can see it's not logically a problem, or might even be a logical necessity, but our imagination, our brains, our envisioning cannot comprehend that. We can't grasp it. And so the challenge I would have for a Muslim is to say, give me any other attribute that you can do that, and they can't. And so then I would point out that there's a double standard here, that when it comes to other attributes of God that we all agree on, and Muslims and Christians agree on, we are perfectly happy to see that, okay, there's no logical contradiction here. There's a rational reason to believe that God would have this attribute, but I don't expect to be able to grasp it with my mind and envision it. But then when it comes to the Trinity, all of a sudden we now add that extra requirement, like, oh, I must also be able to like grasp that. And to me, it's just a double standard, and we should dismiss it and say, we don't need to do that. That's not a fair requirement.
Right. Wow, this has been very thorough, and I appreciate that. It's been some great information there. I hope people will endure through these deep moments, and I appreciate your time today, Isaac. It's been enlightening for me as well, and it's just been a real pleasure having you with us today, and thank you very much for your time.
Thank you very much, Brian. I appreciate it.
Okay, you take care now.
Thank you.